I still have a few metal shirts that I can pull off from high school. Like I have my Emperor Lost and Curse of Reverence long sleeve from high school. Like a death symbolic. There's a few that I can still kind of fit into and they haven't like dissolved, fortunately. So
If you don't have a growth spurt after you get into these bands, you're on a winner, really.
well, and also remember in the mid 90s, late 90s and stuff, everybody was buying XL everything. It was
Yes,
weird. So like luckily I still fit into those. I haven't really like grown that much, but still, developed a little bit more, So
yeah, it's good the skinny fit wasn't in trend in the 90s, or
I
we'd all
know,
be
no doubt about it.
tight and
So
thin.
cool. All right. Well, I'm gonna get going because I know it's late for you, and plus I do have something in about 45 minutes or so. So I'm hoping
Okay,
we can rock and roll and get everything kind of in and stuff if you're ready to rock.
absolutely.
Um, so I guess we'll start with how did you discover Venom and where were you in your kind of musical journey and metal evolution when you kind of first stumbled upon them?
I think I was of the age where you discovered Venom retrospectively through bands that were talking about Venom in the 90s. So I didn't really get into extreme. I got into extreme metal, I guess, in around '93, and I got into black metal around '95. So I was too young for that initial. I wasn't there when it happened. The first wave certainly, and but you instantly, as soon as you got into black metal, Venom and Bathory were instantly, and to a lesser extent, I guess, Celtic Frost and Hellhammer, they were part of the cultural makeup, and they were part of the kind of legacy. There were so many references, bands like Mayhem, Gorgoroth, Cradle of Filth, Dark Throne, all Burzum. I mean, like every band would have some reference to those 80s bands, and it was sort of mandatory that you sort of discovered those. I would say like it was clearly a different generation. The people my age, we were a bit. I was a bit younger than most of the Norwegian bands that were coming out, but they still felt like that was those were sort of our peers or of our generation. But yeah, with Venom, it was you sort of couldn't not be aware of their cultural and musical impact, and then you would then explore them, and so that was how I got into it really. And I think I picked up one of their many kind of random compilations that featured tracks from it had tracks from the more obscure albums, and the stuff with Tony, and the later lineups mixed in with the classics from the first three albums. So it was a kind of a weird mix, and that's sort of how I discovered Celtic Frost as well. You were hearing the later stuff plus the newer stuff kind of back to back. So yeah, that was a big one. And then obviously you instantly black metal and Welcome to Hell was sort of you had to know those albums. It was that kind of that much of a fundament to the scene. So, and I was really into I was already really into punk. So for me, in some ways, I preferred stuff like Venom to some of the more metal, bands of the 80s, because I felt like and the same again with Hellhammer and Celtic Frost and Bathory. For me it clicked because as well as being into second wave black metal, I was really into UK punk, and there's so much UK punk in those bands. It was a good, yeah, it was a sort of good symbiosis in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think it's the same for people in our generation that we were kind of all simultaneously discovering the influences and the influence like at the same time,
Yeah,
pre-internet too, especially.
and I remember they brought out not so long after I was into them, they brought out Set in Stone, which was their comeback album. So it was quite a good time to be into Venom because you discovered them in the mid '90s. Suddenly, the original lineup was back, and I always remember that there was a limited edition double CD of that Set in Stone album, which had 10 of the later non original lineup songs re-recorded in the studio with the original lineup. And like myself and my friends, we were spinning that more than the main album because you were hearing classic songs like Manitou and you know, Warhead and stuff, and it was just nice to hear it. And yeah, like those songs back to back with these really rough, raw recordings from the early '80s. So yeah, it was a good time to be into them. And then, of course, the original lineup splintered again, and yeah, that didn't last so long. But it's a funny thing. Coming from the UK, you'd think Venom would be much more part of the kind of cultural and heavy music background, or you'd think that would be a big thing. They're not really as celebrated here as they are elsewhere in the world. If people know Maiden, everyone knows Maiden. Even your guy in the street knows Maiden. Every metal fan, it'd be a brave metal fan who said, "I don't like Iron Maiden." It's that kind of basic, and we look at them as being an English, kind of flying the flag for English metal and all that. But in a funny way, Venom have never really had that level of, because they've never really been, they've never really had that consistent presence.
Yeah.
They've only played London, I think. So I got into, as I say, I discovered them around '95, and I reckon they've only played the London maybe twice or three times since then.
Wow.
Whereas you could have seen Emperor. Well, I have seen Emperor in London probably 6 times, and I've probably seen Venom. I think I've only seen them twice. They were on tour with Celtic Frost around Monotheist. No, sorry, they weren't. They played in London around the same time as Celtic Frost played Monotheist. And then they also, the other time I saw them was in Norway. So yeah, they just didn't have this kind of, they don't have the presence you did. Because really, you could say that they laid the foundation for all extreme metal.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't feel that they've quite had the recognition. Of course, people like us, we know about them and the legacy, but I would dare to say that Venom are still underrated within metal. I think people still haven't quite had their dues, and I think that is partly because you've got Venom Inc. There's never been that consistent presence that you get with a band like Iron Maiden or Creator or whoever it might be, and I think that's maybe had a little bit of impact on their legacy. I don't think it's quite been realized in a way.
So I guess, like, how do you being from England and stuff, how do people perceive that whole Nawabum scene outside of Maiden? Is it sort of an anomaly for most people where they only really remember maybe Def Leppard and Maiden and the rest of those bands are kind of forgettable? Or do you think it's just because of the uniqueness of Venom that they're not as remembered as much maybe in England?
I think Venom are one of the bands from that movement who are more remembered. I think the new wave of British heavy metal thing became very kind of trendy, is the only word to use it, in latter years. So a generation below us, I guess the people that were discovering metal in the 2000s. And especially in London, there's quite a retro metal scene who are quite into all that stuff, including Venom. And then the older people who are into metal in the '80s, of course, they love that stuff. So it's almost the people in the middle who got missed out a little bit. So I do think Venom have definitely got more. People know Venom better than they know Samson or Praying Mantis or whatever else. But considering that we might not have death and black metal in its current incarnations without them, I think they ought to be better known. And there's a lot of people just aren't aware of the history of it. I mean, I remember I made a post through one of the Cult Never Dies social media a while ago when Mantis was having some ill health, and I said something like, I think I wrote it, and when one of us posted it, we wrote it something like, "This is the guy that invented extreme metal guitars," or and somebody commented, "No, that was Chuck Schuldiner. He did it first." It's like, it's such a basic, and it wasn't a young guy. It was a guy, in his 30s or 40s. But that's the thing. Like, probably a lot of people, if you ask them, they would know Death, or they would know, Maiden and Sabbath, and so they haven't quite got that. They have certainly got more kudos than a lot of new wave of British heavy metal bands, but I don't feel they quite have the kudos that I mean, if a Monomath and Venom play at a gig in London, in England, it's probably a Monomath that would headline.
Yeah.
And nothing against a Monomath, but it's kind of, Maiden haven't, sorry, Venom haven't quite. They should be the Maiden of extreme metal for me.
Yeah.
They should be headlining festivals every year. Either whether it's Venom or Venom Inc. They should be sort of. Yeah, I just feel they haven't because they haven't had that consistency. They just don't quite have the sort of they don't have the stature that they could have. And I don't know to what extent younger fans maybe know. I mean, if you listen to death metal in 2022, you discovered it in the last few years, you might not go back and look at, especially in the more fractured internet age where you can kind of discover bands without context. I feel like maybe those sort of bands are forgotten a little bit in the sort of the canon of whatever metal is. But yeah, I don't think it's much of an exaggeration to say they invented extreme metal, really.
Sure. And I guess that leads me to kind of where I want to take the next questions, which is, I have it kind of written out. Was it indirect through other bands that Venom influenced, or more direct through specific fandom of them? What was it about the spirit of the band that had and inspired this thing that was starting to grow in Northern Europe in the late 80s and early 90s that became now, of course, black metal? Do you think?
I think they married, they were kind of a meeting of maybe 4 different important strands that sort of form the basis for what we now call extreme metal. They had the sinister kind of occult aspect that bands like Black Sabbath most obviously had introduced. They had this kind of they had the raw kind of the rough rock and roll spirit of Motorhead.
Mm-hmm.
They had a lot of punk influence from bands like Sham 69, and also the bands that were coming up alongside them, like Amoebics, they used to tape trade with, and bands like Discharge and stuff. So they had that. And then they also had the sort of finesse. I mean, finesse isn't a word you'd necessarily apply to Venom first, but they had that sort of streamlined riffing that Judas Priest had been kind of building up to throughout the 70s. And I think that was the thing. They kind of had the rock and roll, the punk, the metal, as it had now become this sort of streamlined metal sound, and they had the sinister aspect. And I think that kind of that collision just hadn't. There's nothing that had really combined those things before. I think if Motorhead had released, maybe if Motorhead had released an album in '78 that was inspired by witches and stuff, I mean, that wouldn't be very Motorhead, but that almost could have preempted it, and but again, also Venom took it a stage further with the music. It was definitely heavier than Motorhead. It was more evil than Black Sabbath. It was more kind of attitude than Judas Priest, and it was it kind of it allowed people who liked that punkiness of punk but maybe were not so into the lyrical themes or the fashion or whatever, they could connect with it as well. So I think that was a big thing, really. It created that, and that sort of got the ball rolling. And most obviously the bands that followed would be Hellhammer, Celtic Frost, and Bathory. I mean, those obviously were taken direct inspiration. And at that point, it's like a snowball. I think by the mid 80s, they've sort of formed the genesis of what we now know as extreme metal, and it's sort of rolling. So I think Venom's importance after the first 3 albums is obviously lessened, because they've done it then, and they've created this thing, and it just took on a life of its own in South America and Asia and Northern Europe and so on. And I think the fact that there was that generational gap between them and the bands in Norway was also important, because the bands in Norway could sort of selectively ignore the humor in Venom.
Teachers, things like that.
Yeah, exactly. There's a sort of I always think it's going too far. People like to say, like, it was all tongue in cheek with Venom, and I think it's going a bit far. Like some of those songs, I don't think are tongue in cheek, but some of them definitely are. It's that mix up, and probably if bands like, if that Norwegian wave of seminal artists, Swedish, Finnish, Greek, if those bands were a bit younger or Venom had been a bit older, it might have been harder to distance it and extract it and make it more serious. So I think it was kind of circumstance as well as their own genius. And let's face it, it's songwriting as well. I mean, they were just amazing songwriters. It's very easy to overlook that, and you often hear people. It was one thing that always confused me getting into Venom in retrospect, in the mid-90s and onwards, was that people, especially the UK press at that time, was really kind of, apart from Terrorizer magazine, they were quite dismissive. They were sort of like, and actually it has to be said that quite a few people in black metal are a bit dismissive as well, to the extent that it was sort of like, well, this is where it came from, and you have to recognize that, but let's fast forward to where it gets important, and that's what I felt with a lot of books on black metal. That was sort of part of the sort of impetus behind the black metal book I wrote, was kind of showing how these 80s bands, they weren't just like something to rush through and kind of give context. They were channeling whatever it is that we all kind of are drawn to and within extreme metal now. So I always found it strange when people said, Venom, they look great, they didn't have the songs, or they sounded like shit or whatever. It's like, they really, they sound great. I like black metal, the album, more now than I did 25 years ago. And you can't say that of every album. I do think it's a genuinely great album. And I think the sound is fantastic. I think we learned through bands like Dark Throne and Vlad Tepes and whoever else that a good production isn't necessarily a clean production. I wouldn't want to necessarily, it was interesting to hear them update the songs, but you still, if you wanted the definitive version of a song from black metal, you'll probably go to that album. And I think someone said it had the dynamic range of a flat pizza, but that's sort of,
I think that's in your book. Yeah.
yeah. But that's kind of what makes it great. Like if they'd come out with a 32 channel California rock star production in that album, I really don't think it would have had the same atmosphere, and so I think that was another thing that was important, was it was a bit like the Clash or whatever punk band, in the sense that I think people could listen to Venom and say that's achievable. I love Judas Priest, they're one of my favorite bands, but if you listen to Judas Priest, it could, and you're a young musician, it could probably be quite hard to relate to, or hard to see how you could sort of reproduce that. And I suppose with Venom, it's all quite simple to play, but it's good songwriting. And I suppose that's that makes it relatable for a lot of people, and especially young bands who are getting into it later on.
Yeah, there's something aspirational about it, right? Like early on,
Yeah, and a bit more rooted in something a bit more primal. I suppose that's because Black Sabbath, all those bands by the 80s had become very good at playing, which is great, but there was a reason that punk was so embraced and bands like Motorhead were so embraced, and that's because they stripped things down again. So I think in a way you needed Venom to do that within a metal context, maybe, and sort of, they were able to strip things down in a way where so many people could then build on it in their own different directions, whether it was Creator or Bathory or Celtic Frost or Mayhem, Rotting Christ. The list is almost endless. I would say almost every band, directly or indirectly, playing death or black metal or thrash. Mm-hmm. They do also, Slayer's a very obvious example, Metallica. So from Metallica to Dark Throne, it's a broad palette, that they managed to kind of paint with.
In your research, putting together the black metal books that you've done, who did you see or who did you experience in your interviews that seemed to have the most direct kind of fandom to Venom? Because like you said, some of those bands were fairly dismissive of Venom's influence, whereas some like openly seemed to kind of acknowledge it. you'll hear people from Mayhem kind of talk about Venom and Dark Throne and things like that. But who are like a couple of the examples you can kind of share that in your experience seem to really embrace and understand, whether it's the sound, the image, or just the aura of Venom, I guess the most?
Well, two that spring to mind, both friends of ours, are Psy, who are funnily enough in London tonight to play tomorrow. But they obviously, Psy are massively inspired by Venom to the extent that they released whole albums just of Venom songs. And actually, the first time Psy played in London, they only played Venom songs, kind of bizarrely. So Venom, so Psy are obviously massively inspired by Venom, and that's an interesting one because Psy couldn't be more different, really, as a metal band than Venom. You know, they've gone off in all sorts of different directions. But I know Mirai would still put Venom in his top 10. So, you know, he's a classically trained musician, or at least, you know, he's harnessed, you know, parts of classical music, parts of various other genres. So it's kind of interesting that he's still, even as this very technical musician and composer, he's still able to take something from Venom. But the biggest Venom fan I know is actually Mortis. Again, doesn't
yeah.
I mean, huge collection of Venom records, and I mean, I've been with him in record stores, and he's looking for Venom, and you know, he's probably got the biggest collection of Venom vinyl in that I'm aware of.
Wow.
And again, it's interesting because Venom, I mean, there's nothing in Venom obviously in Mortis's music.
Yeah.
But then again, it's about atmosphere, and you know, so. But I think sometimes, of course, there are bands that took more direct, that sound more like Venom, you know, like more retro thrash or whatever. But I think there's something a little bit broader you can take and be inspired, but rather than just copying. I mean, it's cool that there's bands that still sound like Venom, but maybe it's more interesting that there's bands who can take something from it and then maybe take the spirit of it and channel it into different directions, you know.
Yeah, like I mean, I think, you know, Psy is a perfect example, or like even Voivod, right? Voivod kind of started off very Venom-esque, and like, I mean, look at where they've gone. You know what I mean? Like, who would have thunk, you know? So
and I mean, you know, Slayer and Metallica obviously were really into Venom, and they went into, I mean, those are two massive bands who were quite, by the end, have become very stylistically different. So I think that's almost more. But I mean, as I say, it is quite interesting that there's young kids making bands who sound like these older bands. But metal's always had that thing where you can sort of reproduce what people did in the past in tribute, or you can take inspiration in a more sort of abstract way and then create something new. And I'd like to think, I think a lot of bands did that with Venom.
Yeah. So I guess in a personal level, like where, you know, with like an album like, say, Welcome to Hell, because we're going to be covering Welcome and black metal in the part 1 of our Venom, and then everything else in part 2. Do you have personal songs or songs that you still go back to, or you think are kind of high points for Venom in terms of songwriting from that first record? And then we'll kind of talk about black metal after.
It's a bit of a cop out, but I feel like with those first 2 records, it's about the record as much as it's. They're not albums I would listen to one song by. You know, they're sort of partly. I mean, they're not super long, so it's sort of. I find once I put it on, I can't just play one track by those albums. You know? It sounds a bit cliche, but they sort of they suck you in a bit, and I think they're quite immersive in a way. Well, they do sort of, in the same way that the later black metal albums maybe more consciously tried to be, they sort of create a world which you can get drawn into in a way which is perhaps different than a Metallica record or something. That there is a little, I mean, nothing against Metallica, but Metallica, I would say it's more like, here's a collection of songs, and this is a good song, you know, Ride the Lightning, let's play that song, you know. But I think that partly to do with the production, but I think those, I think Welcome to Hell, it's more like an experience that you sort of need to have in its completeness in a way.
Yeah.
And it's almost, you need to adjust your ears because it's such a different, not so much now because, so there's so many different types of metal now and so many different productions, and we've become more used to quote unquote bad productions, rough productions, raw productions. But especially in the 80s, I imagine, and definitely still in the 90s when I was listening to that stuff for the first time, you kind of had to, and I think even now to some extent, you still have to sort of recalibrate a little bit because it's so far from the way metal sounds now, with digital productions, and it's really hard to, you could reproduce it, but there's something about that. I mean, the first album is essentially a demo, and it does sound like a demo. But I guess I think there's nothing wrong with sounding like a demo. That's not a bad thing. And yeah, so it's a bit of a cop out, but I'd say all the songs or none of them. It's sort of, it's just an important, as a barrage of sort of, as a barrage of body blows, and you sort of need to soak them all up.
Yeah, at first when we were putting the playlist together for the episode, I was just going to kind of play like some select songs and stuff. And then I ended up just conceding to play everything from both records,
Yeah.
broken up by interview clips and different things like that, obviously in talk sets. But I just at a certain point, I was like, yeah, I kind of came to the same conclusion. It's sort of one moment, one piece of music for both Welcome and black metal,
Yeah, and it's all in the same spirit. It's not, I don't think, I mean, Teacher's Pet lyrically is obviously something kind of separate from what else is going on, but musically it's all quite sort of from the same place. It's there's nothing that stands out and sounds, it clearly isn't it's not an album that's been recorded over different years with different different moods. It's just a sort of spilling out of a particular spirit, I guess.
Sure. Well, and being that this is, the 40th anniversary of black metal, which is sort of what the impetus for putting this episode together was, you sort of mentioned that you kind of have grown to love that record even more now, 25 years later. What is it about black metal that has grown with you, and what makes that record so alive still today and vital?
I've asked myself that. I guess I would have to, I guess the core of it is good songwriting. I mean, that's, I think, for any music to last with you, and to, for you to be able to grow and discover new things and still come back to it, I think it has to come down to good songwriting. But it's also the ambience, and I think that album has a very kind of distinct ambience, almost as much as, we talk a lot about atmosphere in black metal, and in the last 5-10 years, people even call atmospheric black metal sort of, it's become a subgenre, which to me I always find a bit strange, because I think all black metal by definition should be atmospheric. But a lot of these bands and a lot of these albums, they strive to be atmospheric, and they add elements all throughout which are about build an atmosphere. And I think what's interesting with Venom is you do have things like Buried Alive, where you have, they're telling, there's a narrative there, and there's there's sound effects. So it's not like they're sort of, it's not like they weren't aware of that, but somehow they can play quite a straight rock stroke metal song, and it's still atmospheric without having the trappings, the more obvious trappings of atmosphere. They're able, that album is soaked in atmosphere, and yet it's really catchy. Countess Bathory is a good example. Countess Bathory is just a classic. It's a classic metal song. It's a classic song. We can just strip it down to that. Great riff, great chorus, and yet there's something there about it which is, I wouldn't say unsettling, but macabre, atmospheric, melancholy maybe. There's something in there, and I think that's the interesting thing with in a way these are just rough rough and ready, fairly basic metal stroke rock songs. And yet they're elevated to something more by the energy within them and the sort of sinisterness about them, this atmosphere. So I suppose I think that's why it's lasted so well, because the songs at their core are great songs, but it also has something. It has the the aura that a classic record needs.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess, since you're, kind of an expert in the field of black metal, having written a couple books and things like that, do you get the feeling that Venom themselves, and in your experience of having interviewed those guys, that they're proud of the influence that they had on, say, black metal as a movement? Or do you think it's mixed to some extent because of some of the notoriety and negative associations that genre kind of had in the 90s? Where have you, because I've struggled to find that out, because I've heard Kronos say good things, but I've also heard the other. So I didn't know if you had any thoughts on that.
I think he's definitely mellowed in his over the years. I think originally he was kind of maybe baffled by the connection, because I suppose you have to, it's about context, a lot of it. And I don't think Kronos is somebody who's striving to be up to date with the latest metal bands. I think that's fair to say. And in the early 90s, when you had all the stuff coming out of Norway, Krang were running these kind of expose type stories, and they were kind of one of the press groups that would present this as saying, look, this is to do with you. So it's kind of natural that these guys are a bit older, and were not practicing, they weren't involved in that sort of criminality or that approach to occultism. It's not surprising that they would say, well, this isn't really what we were about. And they initially, you can see in the interviews in the 90s, they're really trying to distance themselves from it. I think by the late 90s, they were a little bit more open to it. And actually, Kronos appeared with his cousin. His cousin is in the band Enthroned, which is, I guess, one of the more successful black metal bands of the 90s. And so he appeared with them, and he appeared on the Cradle of Filth's Dusk and Her Embrace. So I think at that point he was starting to accept it more. When I interviewed him the first time, I guess it was 2007, and I interviewed him again in 2009. And at that time, his stance was that he didn't know why they called it black metal. He felt they should have given it their own name, like Norse metal or something. He felt they created something amazing, but his position has always been like that Venom was black metal, speed metal. It was all these things, and they've kind of taken a little piece of that and which is fair enough. That's a kind of fair enough perspective. And then the last time I met him, which I think was 3 or 4, it was before lockdown, so I guess 3 or 4 years ago. And I actually gave him a copy of the black metal book, because for some reason I never gave him a copy, or he never received a copy, I think, maybe. But anyway, he at that point he was a little bit more. I think I felt like over the years each time he's a little bit more mellow, but towards the idea of black metal. But I don't think he really sees Venom in it, and it's probably a bit weird for him, because he or the band came up with the name black metal, and that was kind of their thing, and then it became a genre. So I suppose if that happens, you might look at the genre and say, well, I don't see myself in it that much, yet they're using my name in a way. So it's probably like that. I would say that Mantis is much more into current bands, and he's sort of more connected to the metal scene, but again, none of them have gone into that. If you compare it to, say, Tom Warrior from Celtic Frost, he really initially, I think, was also alienated, didn't really relate to black metal, but eventually he delved into it, and he sort of became quite an important figure within contemporary black metal, to the extent that he's working with bands like 1349. He's creating he's quite happy with the black metal tag, and he's yeah, it feels like he's part of the black metal scene. I think all the members of Venom, they were never in any scene. You couldn't really even say. I mean, I remember one of them. I can't remember who it was, but one of the three of them, when I spoke to them, said, I think I said, like, you know, did you ever feel like you were part of the black metal scene, or was it more the new wave of British? And he was like, no, all those new wave of British heavy metal bands hated us, so we didn't feel part of that either. And I think I suppose that's what makes Venom kind of interesting, is that they were not sort of they were never in any scene. They just did their thing. And I mean, I don't even know if they would, all the thrash bands that kind of took them, played with them in America, and took their sound to greater commercial heights. But I'm not sure even if Venom would consider themselves thrash, or would see that much in common with the thrash bands. So yeah, I think that initial reluctance to be associated with black metal was simply due to all the hysteria. There was a lot of hysteria in the UK at that time. There was a minor outbreak of kind of crime, sort of criminal acts in churches and all that sort of stuff. And I think it was quite normal. They wanted to sort of distance themselves from that. But yeah, I think they accept now and understand how important they are to black metal. But I can't imagine any of them go home and listen to black metal on the end of a hard day. I think that's unlikely.
For sure. Two more real quick, just to get kind of out of here. What about At War with Satan and Possessed, or any of the other 80s output? Where are your thoughts with that kind of post black metal stuff? Are you a fan of that stuff? Where do you see it fitting in the Venom legacy for you, or just in a historical?
I don't think they ever did a bad album. Obviously, some albums are better than others, and some albums are much less important than others. That's for sure. But I mean, I've got a signed copy of two of their 80s albums, late non-classic albums, and I still listen to them. And yeah, so for me, it's I think the whole Venom body of work is absolutely worth time. But did it have the same musical and cultural impact? Definitely not. I think, and if I had to have one, if I could only take one album of theirs to a desert island, it's probably going to be black metal. So I don't know if I want to say they never got as good as black metal, but then again, there's so many of us who would choose that album. Maybe that is and that's a curse of a lot of bands. I think, if you're going to have one Clash album, would it be the final one? For nobody, it would be. It would be one of the first two or three. And there's so many bands like that. I mean, Metallica, Cannibal Corpse, whatever it was, any of those big bands, you don't want to write off the stuff that came later just because of that thing. Oh, I only listened to the first few albums or whatever. So yeah, I do think the later albums are overlooked. I think Venom fans should check out the modern stuff and Venom Inc., because they're kind of both bands, the Kronos incarnation of Venom and Venom Inc. are both definitely putting out stuff in Venom, continuing Venom's legacy. But probably it's fair to say that the later albums are not as consistent. I think I wouldn't say there's like in the early albums, it's hard to find a bad song. And everything's more or less the same. They're all great in a way. And I would say the later songs, I don't think and none of their albums are devoid of value, but you could probably start cherry picking. There's the bit more the opposite of what we were talking about earlier. You could probably start cherry picking songs with the later stuff. And Venom's had so many incarnations. There's no member that's on every Venom release. So there's sort of it's a bit like Black Sabbath. There's some stuff is a bit debatable about how Venom is that album. But yeah, I would say even I've got all the latest all the later albums, and they've all got good songs. As I say, they're not all classic songs, but it's hard. I don't think they really want to. I don't think either band wants to recreate what they did on those early albums, and I don't think it would be possible to recreate. I think if you were clever, you could probably recreate, I don't know, the first Emperor album. You could probably come close to that. If you were clever, you could probably recreate early Megadeth, but with early, it's not just about the kind of the context. There's so much accidental chemistry. I think it's just about that. There's so much accidental chemistry on these early albums that you just can't, you can't kind of you can't replicate that.
Absolutely.
And maybe some of those later lineups didn't quite have the same chemistry. Doesn't mean they're not. That doesn't mean they're not good, but they don't have that spark. And I suppose that spark, that energy, is probably what's kept us all interested in Venom.
Sure.
It's not technical ability. It's not timing. It's not fantastic recording aesthetics or whatever. It's just that sort of spark, and that's tough to reproduce. But yeah, to answer your question, I would say that you can look at Venom as a whole, and I think it's important to follow them through and see the different incarnations.
Absolutely. Well said. And then I guess just final question is just any other sort of fun memories or stories of your experiences, either seeing Venom or interactions with them for the book that are kind of worth sharing?
That's a tough one.
If not, no worries. I always like to ask that just in case there's a funny tidbit or cool experience or something. I for example got to meet them at Milwaukee Metal Fest in '97 for the reunion of the original lineup, and I was just fresh out of high school, and we ended up. It was Danny Filth's birthday party, and that was when Cradle of Filth played and Venom. Those were the two headliners, and we somehow got backstage, and I was eating birthday cake with Kronos, and it was like an 18-year-old me in 97 probably didn't appreciate that moment, but now I'm like, damn, that's pretty fucking cool, that kind of happened. So anyways, I just wanted to see if there was anything that you've kind of had experiences with those guys.
I don't think I have anything as iconic as eating birthday cake with Craig.
Sorry.
I mean, I've met him quite a few times, and worked. I've interviewed him a lot, and I suppose, and all of them, and also, I mean, I've met all the guys from the band, and I always found them to be nice. I mean, I always found them to be easy to work with. I suppose one thing I would say is that Venom are quite famous for being difficult to work with and all this sort of stuff, and they probably are. Maybe. It wouldn't be a huge leap of imagination for me to think, but I have to say, in all my times that I met Venom, they were always good guys, and I think I remember when they played London, they again, it was a backstage, it was an after party, but him and his brother had remembered one of the reviews I'd written about a positive one, thankfully. But I thought, there was a sort of, I thought that was interesting, and I don't have a very good point to make here, but generally I thought that they were they definitely have presence, and I think one thing that became clear is that I can see why that original lineup never stayed together for that long, because they're such different people. Especially Matt. I mean, I don't really know Abaddon much. I can't say I know any of them closely, but having met the other guys, I can see the vibe from Mantis and the vibe from Kronos was about as different as it could get. And I think if you look at the way they've lived their lives in the 40 years since, and the way they come across now, they're very different people. So that's one thing. It made more sense, that part of it in retrospect, that original lineup could never stay together, because they're clearly all just coming from very different places.
For sure, indeed.
And maybe that friction was what gave the chemistry. I think there's a lot of bands who kind of didn't necessarily get on, but that creates, especially in heavy music, that you almost want a bit of friction sometimes. And what's Venom if it's not it's not about friction? What is it about?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I really do appreciate this. I'll let you know when we get this all together and send you, obviously send you the episode to share away and stuff like that. Mortiz did tell me to say hi for you.
Oh, brilliant.
Uh, yeah, he apologized for some of his answers. He says, you know, when you talk to him, he'll give you way better stuff than I'm giving you, and I
Oh, that's very nice of him.
um I'm terrible at pronunciation. So how do you pronounce your first name? Just so I say it right on the episode.
I pronounce it Dayal.
Dial. Okay. All right.
As long as it's two syllables,
Okay.
that's the only thing.
Yeah.
'Cause
Yeah.
it's not
Perfect.
Dale. Yeah. It's an Indian name, so they would pronounce it Dayal.
Dial. Okay. All right.
But anything as two syllables with the emphasis on the yal, so it's Dayal, not
Yeah.
Dayal.
Got it.
You know, everyone gets it wrong, so it's
Dial.
okay.
Got it. Perfect.
I meant to say, I assume this is, we're not using the video for this, right?
No, no, no. Yeah, we're good. Yep. So just the audio and stuff like that. But where are you out of in England? Just out of curiosity.
Gloucestershire.
Okay.
Well, where am I now, you mean?
Yeah. Yeah. Just
Yeah, Gloucestershire, yeah.
okay.
We were based in London for until about 3 years ago, and then we moved west. So we're towards Wales, basically.
Okay. I lived in Enfield. So that's why I was
Really?
asking. So yeah, I student taught there and lived there for about 3-4 months, and have some contacts still there. And great experience. Loved it. So,
I lived most of the time in London in Southgate.
oh, okay. Yeah, that's pretty near, right? Wasn't that on the same line, the Piccadilly, right?
Yeah, in Enfield.
Yeah.
It's yeah. Were you in Enfield town?
Yeah, that's where my host family was. I'm trying to remember the school I taught at. It was a all girls school. Enfield, I don't know that I could. I'll
Very good.
yeah, it was cool. I mean, it was 2002 was when I was there, so it was a interesting
Yeah.
time period. So
Yeah. Yeah, I lived all around London, but I sort of ended up settling in Enfield County.
okay,
Yeah, Southgate being the main. Yeah.
weird.
I really
Who
like that
knows?
part.
Maybe we were at the same pub at certain times. Who knows? Because I was.
If you're in an Enfield pub, it's very possible.
Yeah, yeah, indeed. So, but all right. Well, I appreciate it, and I know it's late for you there, and I'll let you know when this episode's up and cooking. Should be ready, I think, around Christmas time is what we're kind of hoping for. So,
Yeah, let me know and I can share on our socials. And
perfect. Appreciate it. So, all right. Take care. Appreciate it.
thank you.
Yep.
Cheers,
Have
man.
a good night. Yep. Cheers.